So something that can happen, particularly in summer, is that walkers have symptoms of heat exhaustion or even heat stroke. How do we identify that that might be happening, and what do we do in those situations?
Okay, so these are two fairly serious conditions, and as you mentioned, you know, it's a possibility with hot weather and where people are doing physical exercise. We're going to know obviously what the weather forecast is for the day, so that tells us if there's an increased risk of things like heat exhaustion happening, or in the very worst case, heat stroke. So we need to know what to look for in these instances. If people are wearing too much clothes, that can contribute to things like heat exhaustion. So as a leader, you know, if you see somebody walking along, a bit of prevention is far better than ending up having to manage heat stroke. So make sure people are not wearing too many layers. Make sure they're stopping to take drinks and cool down frequently. You know, that's part of the role of being a leader, you know, where it's a hot day. Make sure people are taking frequent rests in shade. And when they're in the shade, you know, if they're wearing a hat, take your hat off, let some heat off. You know, make sure you're not wearing too many layers. But once people do overheat, they're starting to go into heat exhaustion, and there's a number of symptoms that we associate with heat exhaustion, which I'm just going to read out now. So one of them could be that you could have a headache, you've got a high body temperature above 40 degrees, you might get muscle cramps, you might get dizziness, nausea, and possibly even vomiting. You get exhaustion and general weakness. If you look at people's skin, it might be pale, cool, and clammy. You know, not always. When you're sweating, it's usually a sign that your body is regulating your temperature. You know, that's what sweating is. But it can become quite flushed, people's skin, and then possibly red later. These are dead giveaways. You know, somebody's overheating. So the best thing to do is just get them to stop, get them into the shade, get them to drink water, small sips of water frequently, have a rest, and try and cool them down, because again, you don't want that to progress into heat exhaustion, and for heat exhaustion to progress into heat stroke. If you've got somebody and they're sat down and you've done those things, you know, and the muscle cramps and all these different symptoms are happening and they're dizzy, it's probably best that, you know, we stop them walking until they're feeling much better, and then they can continue to the next checkpoint and maybe check out of the walk at that point if we think they're going into heat exhaustion. That's the safest thing. If somebody's starting to become a bit unresponsive with this, you know, or they're vomiting and they're continuing to vomit, we're going to call emergency services, because there's a fine line between somebody being in heat exhaustion and that progressing into heat stroke, which is a very serious life-threatening condition. So we're going to try and cool them down. We're going to see if they're okay. If they're not okay, then we're going to either call for help, or at the very least get them to exit the walk into a place where we can help them and cool them down. So how do we know we're dealing with heat stroke? A person may, at the worst instance, fall unconscious if they've got heat stroke. So again, you're going to call emergency services as fast as you can, because this is a life-threatening condition. Some of the symptoms that you're going to get for heat stroke, typically they're no longer sweating. You know, they've used up their fluids already. The temperature again is above 40 degrees. They're red hot, dry skin, rapid strong pulse. They might also have rapid breathing, noisy breathing, hyperventilating. It might show as irrational aggressive behavior, because literally their brain is overheating, and the deterioration of the conscious state. So if somebody's just not making sense to you, you know, it's a very bad sign. You know, you need to assume the worst, call emergency services. Same thing as for heat exhaustion, get them into the shade, pour water over them to cool them down, fan them, do whatever you can to lower their body temperature, take any layers off that are practical to take off, and just do whatever you can to kind of stabilize that person, get them into a recovery position if it's needed. Particularly if you know, they're losing consciousness, you're going to have to get them into the recovery position. and stabilise them until the emergency services arrive where you are. Same scenario as before. If you haven't got phone signal, you're sending somebody forwards or backwards to the last known place where you had a phone signal, and you're getting onto the emergency services. And obviously with these kind of serious incidents, other people in the team need to know, so you're going further up the chain of command and letting them know with these serious incidents as soon as possible that this is happening.
And we don't want to get to that situation where there's a heat stroke. So on a hot day, it's important to keep a really close eye on our walkers, and when there's symptoms of heat exhaustion, that we take it seriously and know that it can actually get to heat stroke, and we don't want to get to that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you're doing your job and you're monitoring people and you can see people look like they're getting very red in the face and they seem to be overheated and they're struggling with the heat, manage that. When you're walking with people on a hot day, it's a possibility that heat exhaustion can occur. So if somebody's looking like they're getting quite red in the face, they're puffing and panting, sweating copiously earlier in the day, or maybe not sweating, but they look like they're overheating, get them to stop, get them to cool down in the shade, pour water over themselves, lose layers, manage it as best you can, and you won't end up with heat exhaustion. That goes a long way. Actually keeping an eye on people and making sure that you don't get to those stages to start with is a far better tactic than having to deal with the heat exhaustion when it occurs.
And so we are in Victoria, and it could be cold even anything can happen. So what happens if it's a really wet day, people are wet, they're cold?
The opposite, yeah. So when people get cold and wet, there is a danger of hypothermia. It's quite unlikely, I've got to say, at the time of year in which we're walking and the terrain in which we're walking. Usually, when you get cold and wet, it's, a rainy day, you're soaked to the skin, you've just got to keep moving. It does come back to, obviously, what gear people set out with in the first place, and that you need to make sure that, people are putting the rain jackets on when it's raining. It's an obvious thing to do, but they may not do it, and that they have a rain jacket, and you've got to keep an eye on the people who maybe they haven't got one and they are getting soaked to the skin. As long as you keep moving, you're unlikely to get hypothermia unless it's a brutally cold day and windy day, but when people stop, that's when the danger comes in, and particularly if you're seeing people are starting to shiver, then definitely you're starting to head into the danger zone a bit. So you might get them to, depending where you are, put on another layer. You might lend them another layer if they haven't got one, and try and keep them warm and keep them moving, get them to the next checkpoint, the next point where we can help them, and we can get them warm inside a vehicle, or we can transfer them on. But basically, it's a relatively minor risk, I feel, for the time of year and the terrain that you're walking in. But as I say, keep people moving when they're wet, and try and encourage them to, layer up and put enough layers on and enough waterproofs on to start with, and you'll eliminate the risk.